The smell of aviation fuel hung thick in the pre-dawn air as Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of Akagi, watching his four carriers cut through calm seas toward a tiny atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Oahu. June 4th, 1942. The same carriers that had gutted Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now steamed in formation, their decks spotted with Zeros, Vals, and Kates, the steel fist of Japanese naval aviation. What Nagumo couldn't know was that every radio message his fleet had transmitted for the past 3 weeks had been read, decoded, and dissected by a basement team of American cryptanalysts who had just set the most devastating ambush in naval history. This wasn't just another carrier battle. This was the moment American intelligence would prove more lethal than Japanese steel. Before we dive into the chaos that's about to unfold, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you want more untold stories from history's most decisive moments, hit that like button and subscribe. We've got plenty more where this came from. The mathematics of Midway began not with bombs, but with pencils. Deep beneath the pineapple fields of Pearl Harbor, inside a basement complex called Station Hypo, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers had been working 20-hour shifts since April, hunched over intercepts from Japanese naval code JN-25. The messages spoke of a massive operation, a target designated only as AF. Through static and encryption, patterns emerged: fuel requirements, ship movements, dates clustering around early June. But AF remained a cipher within a cipher. Rochefort needed confirmation. In late May, he orchestrated a trap so simple it bordered on genius. He instructed Midway's garrison to send an uncoded radio message complaining of freshwater distillation equipment failure. Within 48 hours, Japanese intercepts reported that AF was short of fresh water. The target was confirmed. Midway Atoll, the date, early June. The ambient noise of war preparation echoed differently on both sides of the Pacific. Aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, Japanese deck crews performed maintenance with the confidence of men who had never tasted defeat. These weren't merely warships, they were symbols, the carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had ravaged the Indian Ocean, that had sent the Royal Navy fleeing from Ceylon. Their pilots were the elite, their tactics proven, their doctrine refined through 8 months of unbroken victory. Invincibility is a drug. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, walked the flight deck of Akagi on the evening of June 3rd, watching mechanics service aircraft under harsh electric worklights. The routine smells surrounded him: hot oil, canvas, the faint sweet rot of the anti-corrosion grease, mixed with cigarette smoke from off-duty pilots playing cards in the ready rooms below. The ship's wooden deck, polished by thousands of boots, creaked rhythmically with the ocean swell. Everything felt routine. Everything felt certain. But 500 miles to the northeast, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily patched Yorktown, waited in ambush. Admiral Raymond Spruance and Admiral Frank Fletcher commanded a force that, on paper, was outgunned. The Americans knew it. Their pilots knew it. The difference was information. While Nagumo steamed toward what he believed was an unsuspecting target, American radar operators on Midway, signal intelligence officers aboard the carriers, and patrol plane crews scanning the horizon all knew exactly where the Japanese fleet would appear. At 5:53 on the morning of June 4th, Midway's radar picked up the first wave of Japanese aircraft at 93 nautical miles. The island scrambled everything that could fly: Marine F-4F Wildcats, obsolete Vought Vindicators, even lumbering B-17 bombers. It wasn't enough to stop the strike, but it was enough to bleed it, to make Nagumo think, to force decisions that would cascade into catastrophe. The Japanese attack hit Midway at 6:30. Bombs cratered runways, fuel tanks erupted in black towers of flame, and buildings collapsed into rubble and coral dust. But the island's defenses fought back with desperate fury, and critically, they survived. Enough fuel, enough runway, enough rage. When strike leader Joichi Tomonaga radioed back to Nagumo at 7 o'clock, his message carried a poison pill. There is need for a second attack. Nagumo hesitated. His doctrine, his training, everything told him to hold his reserve aircraft armed for anti-ship operations, in case American carriers appeared. But American carriers? Intelligence had assured him there were none within 1,000 miles. The Midway installation needed suppression. At 7:15, he gave the order that would seal his fleet's fate. Prepare to rearm aircraft with land attack ordnance. What would you have done, standing on that bridge, staring at incomplete information, weighing doctrine against intuition? Deep in Akagi's hangar decks, crews began the laborious process of swapping torpedoes for bombs, aviation fuel hissing through transfer lines, ammunition handlers shuffling racks of ordnance across decks slick with condensation and hydraulic fluid. It took time. Precious, irreplaceable minutes. At 7:28, a Japanese scout plane, one of only 7 launched that morning, finally radioed the discovery that would shatter Nagumo's certainty. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway. Surface ships, not carriers. Nagumo demanded clarification. At 7:50, after an eternity of radio silence, the scout added, "Enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier." The ordnance crews, already halfway through rearming, reversed course in barely controlled chaos. Bombs came off. Torpedoes went back on. The hangars filled with the pneumatic screech of arming mechanisms, the shouts of handlers, and the acrid stink of fuel vapor mixing with sweat and fear. Above them, on the flight decks, the returning Midway strike force began landing. Aircraft shot full of holes, pilots reporting heavy resistance, fuel gauges kissing empty. The carriers were trapped by their own success, their decks crowded with thirsty, damaged aircraft that needed immediate recovery, while below, fresh strike planes sat fueled, armed, and waiting for launch. Everything had to happen in sequence. Recover the Midway strike, refuel and rearm them, launch the anti-carrier strike. But sequence requires time, and time, unknown to Nagumo, had just run out. 300 miles away, American torpedo and dive bomber squadrons were already airborne, racing toward the coordinates Rochefort's basement team had predicted with eerie precision. The ocean below was empty, infinite, indifferent. The sky ahead held 4 Japanese carriers whose crews believed they still controlled the Pacific. The mathematics were about to become fire. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's handwriting trembled slightly as he wrote his final message to his wife the night before launch. "If I don't come back, know that I led my men the best I could." He sealed the envelope, handed it to Hornet's chaplain, and walked to the ready room where 15 torpedo bomber crews, Torpedo Squadron 8, waited in the stale air of cigarette smoke and nervous sweat. The Douglas TBD Devastators parked on the flight deck above them were already obsolete, slow as school buses, armed with torpedoes that worked only when luck intervened. Waldron knew what he was leading his men into. He briefed them anyway. The mathematics of courage sometimes require subtraction. At 7:30 on the morning of June 4th, the first American squadrons began launching. The choreography was brutal. catapult officers waving aircraft forward on decks pitching with ocean swell, plane handlers scrambling between propeller arcs, the metallic shriek of arresting gear being repositioned. Hornet's Air Group launched first, followed by Enterprise and the damaged Yorktown. 41 TBD Devastators climbed into scattered clouds, their crews scanning empty horizon for an enemy fleet that existed only as coordinates on plotting boards. The problem was navigation and fuel and time. Most squadrons lost contact with each other immediately. Radio discipline collapsed into static and confusion. Hornet's strike group flew the wrong heading entirely, chasing phantoms across empty ocean until fuel gauges forced them to turn back or ditch. But Waldron, flying lead in VT-8, trusted his instinct over doctrine. At 9:20, he broke radio silence. "The hell with it, I'm going in." He banked left, away from the planned course, following nothing but intuition and the faint smudge of smoke on the horizon. 10 minutes later, his gunner tapped his shoulder and pointed down. 4 carriers, exactly where they shouldn't be. The sight that met Waldron's eyes would have made any tactical officer abort. A task force in perfect defensive formation, escorting destroyers arrayed in a protective screen, and above it all, a swarm of Zeros, Japan's finest fighters, circling like hornets defending a nest. No friendly fighters, no dive bomber support. Just 15 obsolete torpedo planes carrying weapons that barely worked, about to charge into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. Waldron's radio crackled one last time. "Attack immediately!" The sound of the torpedo run became a mechanical symphony of death. The Devastators descended to wave-top height. Regulation required they drop torpedoes from under 200 feet and accelerated to their maximum speed of barely 200 miles per hour. The ocean spray tasted of salt and diesel. The engine roar drowned out everything except the hammering of their own hearts. And then the Japanese opened fire. 20-millimeter tracers like strings of burning pearls. Zeros dove from above, their 7.7-millimeter guns stitching lines across water and aluminum. The Devastators had one defensive gun, a single .30-caliber machine gun operated by the radio man, gunner in the rear seat. Against Zeros doing 350 miles per hour with cannon armament, it was a gesture, not a defense. Aircraft began falling immediately. Some cartwheeled into the sea intact. Others came apart mid-air in clouds of fabric and fuel vapor. Still others simply nosed down, trailing smoke and fire. Ensign George Gay, flying as Waldron's wingman, watched his squadron disappear around him. The pilot ahead exploded into fragments. The plane to his left spun inverted and hit the water so hard it disintegrated. His own aircraft shuddered as cannon shells punched through the fuselage. He could hear them, feel them, metal ripping metal. His gunner, Bob Huntington, kept firing until a 20-millimeter round killed him instantly. Gay pressed his torpedo release at 800 yards from Soryu. The Mark 13 dropped, hit the water, and began its run. Straight, predictable, painfully slow. He watched it track toward the carrier's hull, watched it hit, watched it fail to explode. Dud. His entire squadron was dying for weapons that didn't work. Seconds later, his plane took a direct hit. The engine seized, the controls went dead, and Gay barely had time to pull the stick back before hitting the Pacific at 140 miles per hour. The impact drove his face into the instrument panel, breaking his nose, filling his mouth with blood and salt water. When he surfaced, gasping, disoriented, his aircraft was already gone, a stream of bubbles marking its descent into 3 miles of dark water, He was the only survivor of Torpedo 8, 15 aircraft, 30 men. One came back, but VT-8 wasn't alone in its sacrifice. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked minutes later. Same result. 14 aircraft launched, only 4 returned. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed. 12 aircraft, 7 lost. The ocean around the Japanese carriers became a graveyard of burning aviation fuel, floating parachutes, shattered airframes, and men clinging to debris or sinking beneath the waves. From the Japanese carriers, the defense seemed flawless. Zeros splashed American torpedo bombers with methodical efficiency. Anti-aircraft gunners tracked targets through ring sights, their guns coughing shells in rhythmic bursts. Not a single torpedo struck home. Not one. The decks erupted in cheers. Sailors waved caps. Officers nodded with satisfaction, and Nagumo allowed himself a moment of relief. The Americans had thrown their best punch. It had failed completely. What the Japanese didn't realize was that the torpedo attacks had pulled every Zero down to wave-top height, drawn every anti-aircraft gun to track low-altitude targets, and forced the carriers into evasive turns that broke formation and scattered the protective screen. The sky above 18,000 feet was now completely empty, and the dive bombers were already there. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's scout bombing squadron, had been searching for nearly 2 hours, fuel gauges dropping toward the point of no return, when his rear seat gunner spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast at maximum speed. McCluskey made a gambler's calculation. The destroyer was racing to rejoin the fleet. He followed its wake like a thread through the labyrinth. At 10:20 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, McCluskey pushed over into his dive and saw 4 Japanese carriers laid out below him like children's toys on a blue carpet. Their decks were crowded with aircraft, fueled, armed, and spotted for launch, the most perfect target in the history of naval aviation. "We got 'em," someone said over the radio. The tone was almost conversational. 3 squadrons of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 37 aircraft total, rolled inverted and dropped from 18,000 feet at a 70-degree angle, their perforated dive brakes screaming. The sensation was physical. Acceleration pressing pilots into seats, altitude bleeding away in seconds, the target growing from a dot to a shape to a massive expanse of wooden deck. The Japanese lookouts spotted them too late. Zeros were still low. Guns were still tracking torpedo bombers. Damage control teams were still fighting fires. The dive bombers had perhaps 15 seconds of complete surprise. They used every one. At 1,000 feet, the bomb release mechanisms triggered with a metallic clunk. 1,000-pound bombs separated from wing racks, stabilizing fins deploying with a whisper of aerodynamics. The pilots pulled out of their dives, 5Gs, 6Gs, vision tunneling, blood draining from brains, and climbed away as the world below them transformed into something from Revelation. Ensign Gay, floating in the water with a shredded seat cushion for flotation, watched the entire event unfold from the front row. Years later, he would describe it with the precision of trauma. 3 carriers burning at once. The explosions were continuous. Men were jumping into the water from flight decks 100 feet up. I could hear the secondary explosions even from where I floated. It sounded like the end of the world. The bombs struck decks where fueled aircraft waited to launch. Aviation gasoline ignited instantly, spreading across wooden decks in rivers of flame. Armed aircraft exploded, their ordnance cooking off in chain reactions. Hangar decks below became ovens, temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees, metal warping, paint blistering, men trapped by walls of flame. Akagi took at least one direct hit near the midship elevator. The bomb penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, exactly where fueled Kates and Vals sat waiting for launch. The explosion was catastrophic. Flames shot up the elevator shaft like a blast furnace chimney. Fuel lines ruptured, feeding the fire. Within minutes, the entire hangar complex was an inferno. Kaga suffered worse. Multiple bombs struck her flight deck, each one starting separate fires that merged into a single conflagration. Captain Jisaku Okada died on his bridge when a bomb hit nearby, the concussion killing him instantly. His officers found him slumped in his chair, blood running from ears and nose, internal trauma from overpressure. Soryu burned with such intensity that her hangar deck steel began to glow cherry red. Men trapped below hammered on sealed hatches, their screams audible even over the roar of flames. The entire attack, from first bomb drop to last dive bomber climbing away, lasted 6 minutes. 6 minutes to destroy the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. What do you feel, floating in water slicked with burning oil, watching your enemies die by the hundreds, knowing your own friends have already drowned? Gay would float for more than 30 hours before rescue, hiding under his seat cushion whenever Japanese ships or aircraft passed nearby. Burning with sun exposure, hypothermia setting in as night fell. He watched Hiryu, the fourth carrier, survive the initial attack and launch a counterattack that would eventually sink Yorktown. He watched Japanese destroyers circle the burning carriers like mourners at a funeral. He watched the ocean slowly claim the bodies and debris of the battle. And then finally, he watched the sun rise on June 5th over an empty sea where 4 Japanese carriers had steamed just 24 hours before. The ocean remembers everything. It just doesn't speak. The smell hit first, a nauseating cocktail of burning rubber, aviation fuel, and something else. Something organic that survivors would never quite find words for. Aboard Akagi, damage. Control teams tried to fight fires with buckets and canvas hoses, while the deck beneath their feet radiated heat like the lid of a furnace. Compartment by compartment, the flagship of the Kido Butai was becoming uninhabitable. By 1100 hours on June 4th, 1942, Admiral Nagumo stood on a bridge surrounded by smoke and flame, facing a decision that would haunt Japanese naval officers for generations. Abandon ship. The ritual of surrender is written in steel and ceremony, in tradition older than steam engines. Below decks, the Inferno had created its own weather system. Superheated air rushed through passageways, creating winds that fed the flames and turned corridors into blast furnaces. Men caught in the lower compartments faced a choice between burning or suffocation. Carbon monoxide filled sealed spaces, inducing unconsciousness before death. Some damage control parties simply stopped responding to calls, their silence marking mass casualties in spaces now inaccessible behind walls of flame. Chief Petty Officer Mitsuo Fuchida, the Pearl Harbor strike leader, lay in Akagi's sickbay with a broken ankle from the morning's operations. When the bombs hit, he felt the ship shudder, heard the muffled crump of explosions below, watched paint blister on the bulkhead beside his bunk. The medical staff evacuated casualties to the flight deck, but the deck itself was burning. They moved aft, then forward, chasing shrinking islands of survivable space while the fire consumed the ship around them. Captain Taijiro Aoki of Akagi gave the abandoned ship order at 1900 hours, 12 hours after the bombs fell. By then, the fire had defeated every attempt at control, consumed every firefighting station, melted or warped every pump and hose connection. The Emperor's portrait was ceremonially transferred to a destroyer. The battle flag was lowered. Officers formed ranks on the tilting deck and saluted the rising smoke. Duty requires witnesses, even to catastrophe. Across the water, Kaga was dying faster. Her captain already dead, command fell to senior surviving officers who faced the same impossible mathematics: save the crew or save the ship. By 1600 hours, the choice was made. Over 800 men climbed down ropes and nets into the oil-slicked water, where destroyers maneuvered close, dangerously close, to pick up survivors. Some men jumped from flight decks 70 feet above the waterline, hitting the Pacific hard enough to break bones. Others, trapped by fire, chose the sea over burning. The water itself had become a hostile environment. Fuel oil spread in thick black sheets, coating everything it touched, clogging mouths and noses, burning eyes, making flotation nearly impossible. Men swam through it like tar, their movements sluggish, their uniforms heavy with absorbed petroleum. The oil ignited in patches where burning debris fell, creating temporary walls of flame that survivors had to swim around or under. Ensign Haruo Yoshino, rescued from Kaga by the destroyer Hajikaze, later recorded his memories in a diary discovered by historians in 1993. "I watched men sink because they couldn't swim in the oil. Their heads went under, came up once, went under again. We couldn't reach them. The sea was slick, black, impossible. I can still taste it, bitter, chemical, mixed with salt and something sweet like meat left in the sun. What would you have done? Reached for another drowning man, knowing it might pull you both under." Soryu's end carried its own particular horror. Struck by 3 bombs in rapid succession, her fires spread so quickly that entire sections were cut off before crews could evacuate. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused to leave his bridge. Junior officers begged him to abandon ship. He declined politely, firmly, with the calm of a man who had already made peace with his decision. When the last officer left him, Yanagimoto stood alone on the bridge of his dying ship, singing the Japanese national anthem as flames climbed the superstructure. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, aboard Hiryu, made the same choice. After his carrier took bomb hits in the afternoon, the last of the 4 to die, he gathered his staff officers, distributed final cups of water, and told them to save themselves. He and Captain Tomeo Kaku remained aboard as the crew evacuated. Survivors reported seeing them on the carrier's deck at sunset, sharing a final drink, facing toward Tokyo. The cultural weight of these decisions cannot be measured in Western terms. These weren't suicides. They were acceptances of responsibility, fulfillments of duty encoded in centuries of Bushido tradition. The captains stayed not from despair, but from obligation. Their ships were their commands, their crews their responsibility, their deaths a form of apology to emperor and nation. But obligation doesn't stop fire, doesn't cool steel, doesn't resurrect the dead. By nightfall on June 4th, 3 of the 4 carriers were abandoned hulks. Akagi burned through the night, her hull glowing red in patches, secondary explosions sending columns of sparks into the dark. Japanese destroyers circled the wrecks, picking up survivors and watching for American submarines that might be stalking the wounded fleet. The human arithmetic was staggering. Akagi lost roughly 220 men. Kaga lost over 800. Soryu lost 718, including Captain Yanagimoto, still singing on his bridge. Hiryu, hit later in the afternoon by dive bombers from Enterprise, would burn through the night and sink at dawn on June 5th, taking Admiral Yamaguchi, Captain Kaku, and 416 men with her. The total, over 3,000 Japanese sailors dead. 3,000 men who had awakened that morning confident, competent, certain of victory. The ocean doesn't judge, it only accepts. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, flying an SBD Dauntless from Enterprise, passed over the burning carriers late on June 4th during a reconnaissance flight. He later wrote in his memoirs, "The sight was biblical. 4 carriers burning, their smoke columns rising thousands of feet, the ocean around them black with oil and debris. I thought of Armageddon. I thought of the end of the world. Then I thought of Pearl Harbor, and I didn't feel sorry anymore." The mechanical finality came at dawn on June 5th. Japanese destroyers, operating under Admiral Yamamoto's orders, fired torpedoes into the abandoned carriers to prevent capture. Kaga went first. 4 torpedoes struck her hull, and she settled by the bow, her stern lifting high before she slid beneath the surface. Soryu followed an hour later, her fires finally quenched by the Pacific's cold embrace. Akagi, the flagship, lasted longest. Her crew had built her well, and she refused to die easily. It took 4 destroyer torpedoes before she finally rolled to port and sank just after 500 hours on June 5th. Hiryu, burning throughout the night of June 4th, sank on her own around 900 hours on June 5th. Survivors later reported seeing her bow rise vertical, her propellers still visible, before she slipped beneath the waves, taking Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku, still aboard, into the deep. The archaeology of defeat tells its own story. Modern deep-sea surveys have located all 4 wrecks, resting in over 17,000 feet of water. High-definition ROV footage shows flight decks collapsed, gun mounts still trained skyward, and personal effects scattered across debris fields. A ship's bell here, a sake cup there. The skeletal framework of an aircraft carrier reduced to its essential geometry. No human remains are visible. The ocean has claimed those, redistributed them into the universal cycle of salt and time. But the artifacts remain, testimony to craftsmanship and courage, hubris and horror, the price of strategic miscalculation measured in sunken steel and drowned men. For the Americans, the victory came with its own butcher's bill. Yorktown, crippled by Japanese bombs and torpedoes from Hiryu's final counterattack, was taken under tow on June 5th. Salvage crews worked frantically to save her, pumping water, patching holes, restoring power. On June 6th, she seemed stable enough to survive. But Japanese submarine I-168, stalking the wounded carrier, fired a spread of 4 torpedoes on the morning of June 7th. 3 struck home. Yorktown, veteran of Coral Sea, survivor of a 72-hour emergency repair that should have taken months, finally capsized and sank at dawn on June 7th. The destroyer Hammond, tied alongside providing power to Yorktown, took a torpedo hit and broke in half. She sank in 4 minutes, her depth charges exploding as she went down, killing many of her crew still in the water. 307 Americans died at Midway. Compared to Japanese losses, the number seems small. But every telegram delivered to every family carried the same weight. Beloved son, husband, father lost at sea. The mathematics of grief don't scale with statistics. The strategic implications crystallized within days. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, the core of their offensive naval power, along with over 250 aircraft, and most critically, hundreds of experienced pilots and deck crews. These were irreplaceable losses. The IJN could build new carriers eventually, but veteran aviators took years to train. The industrial capacity to replace them simply didn't exist. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the disaster aboard his flagship Yamato, positioned 300 miles behind the carrier force, too far away to influence events, allegedly said, "I have awakened a sleeping giant." Whether he actually spoke those words is debated by historians. What isn't debated is the outcome. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had shifted permanently to the Americans. The battles ahead would be brutal: Guadalcanal, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. But the mathematical certainty of American victory was written in the waters off Midway. The sea remembers. Steel sinks. Stories float. Ensign George Gay tasted diesel and blood and salt for 30 hours before a PBY Catalina spotted his seat cushion bobbing in the Pacific on the afternoon of June 5th. The rescue crew pulled him aboard, sunburned, hypothermic, barely conscious, and wrapped him in blankets that smelled of canvas and machine oil. He couldn't stop shaking. Not from cold, but from the accumulated weight of watching 29 squadron mates die, of floating among burning wreckage while history pivoted around him. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked on a single word. "Everyone?" The crew shook their heads. "Just you." The human cost of victory is always denominated in absences: empty bunks, unanswered mail, families who would spend decades parsing official telegrams for meaning between the lines. Back in Pearl Harbor, Station Hypio's cryptanalysts celebrated with coffee and cigarettes, their basement workspace still cluttered with intercept sheets and decryption matrices. Commander Rochefort, who hadn't slept more than 4 hours in weeks, allowed himself a brief smile when confirmation arrived. All 4 Japanese carriers sunk. His team had predicted not just the location, but the date, the composition, even the tactical approach. Intelligence had become weaponized mathematics, patterns in radio traffic transformed into firepower on target. But Rochefort knew something his celebrating team didn't yet grasp. This wasn't the end of the Pacific War. It was simply the point where American victory became inevitable rather than uncertain. Certainty is cold comfort to the dead. The news reached Japanese cities slowly, filtered through military censorship that transformed catastrophe into tactical repositioning. Radio Tokyo announced a great victory at Midway. Enemy carriers sunk, minimal Japanese losses, while families in Yokohama and Tokyo and Osaka waited for letters from sons and husbands who would never write again. The truth leaked through returning survivors, through whispered conversations in naval offices, through the simple arithmetic of carriers that didn't return to port. Petty Officer Juzo Mori, rescued from Kaga, arrived back in Kure Naval Arsenal in late June 1942. He wrote in a diary that remained hidden until 2008. "We were ordered not to speak of what happened. Not to our families, not to each other, not even to ourselves. The censors read our mail. The Kempeitai watched for loose talk. So we carried the silence like a stone, watching the newspapers lie while we remembered the smell of burning men." The psychological burden of military censorship creates its own casualties. Men forced to smile through false victories while carrying the memory of true defeats. For the Americans, Midway became mythologized almost immediately. Life magazine ran Ensign Gay's story with dramatic illustrations. The lone survivor floating among burning carriers, testament to American courage and Japanese folly. Newsreels showed cheering crowds welcoming returning pilots. The narrative simplified. Plucky American underdogs defeated arrogant Japanese through skill and determination. What the mythology left out was luck. Weather that cleared at precisely the right moment for dive bombers. Japanese scout planes launching late. The fortuitous destroyer that led McCluskey to the target. Midway was as much accident as intention, probability collapsing into history through 10,000 minor variables. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose decision to follow that destroyer's wake had enabled the entire attack, received the Navy Cross and a promotion. He never spoke publicly about the torpedo squadrons that died drawing Japanese defenses low. He never claimed his success was anything more than being in the right place when chaos aligned in America's favor. Heroes are made by silence about what they won't claim. The strategic transformation played out across the next 3 years with mathematical precision. Without carrier superiority, Japan couldn't support offensive operations across the Pacific. Guadalcanal in August 1942 became a grinding attritional battle instead of a swift conquest. The Marianas Campaign in 1944 cost Japan another 400 aircraft and most of its remaining experienced pilots in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that captured American confidence born at Midway. By 1945, American industrial capacity, ship production, aircraft manufacturing, trained crew replacement had created such overwhelming advantage that Japanese strategy devolved into desperation. Kamikazes, suicide boats, plans for national immolation in defense of the home islands. The mathematics of Midway had predicted all of it. Lose carrier power. Lose strategic initiative. Lose the war. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Midway, never lived to see final defeat. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters intercepted his transport plane over Bougainville. Another intelligence coup. Another decrypted message transformed into air power on target. When his aircraft crashed into the jungle, one of the few items recovered intact was his diary. The final entry, written days before, read simply, "The war cannot be won. Only the method of losing remains to be decided." The Japanese carriers themselves remain where they fell. Modern deep-sea exploration has documented each wreck in extraordinary detail. In 1998, Dr. Robert Ballard, who discovered Titanic, located Yorktown sitting upright in 17,400 feet of water. Her flight deck collapsed, but her island superstructure intact. In 1999, a joint U.S.-Japanese expedition found Akagi, her distinctive red-leaded hull still visible beneath decades of sediment. The images are haunting. Gun mounts frozen in their final firing positions. Aircraft elevators jammed half-raised. The geometric shadows of ships that once represented the height of naval engineering, now reduced to artificial reefs colonized by deep-sea life. No human remains visible. The ocean has processed those, redistributed them through the food chain, returned them to the universal cycle. But the ships remain as monuments, war graves protected by international treaty, marked on navigation charts, visited only by remotely operated vehicles whose cameras transmit ghostly footage of steel and memory. In 1945, when Japan surrendered aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, several of Midway's survivors attended the ceremony. Ensign Gay stood on deck watching Japanese officials sign surrender documents 3 years and 3 months after floating among their burning carriers. A reporter asked how he felt. Gay's response made it into several newspapers. "I don't feel victorious. I feel tired. And I feel lucky to be standing here when so many aren't." The memorialization began immediately. Midway became a mandatory study at naval academies worldwide, the perfect case study in intelligence, timing, and tactical execution. But the deeper lessons took longer to absorb. That industrial capacity ultimately determines naval power, that experienced crews matter more than ship tonnage, that cryptanalysis can be as decisive as gunnery, that close-run victories often depend on factors no doctrine can control. By 2025, 83 years after the battle, fewer than a handful of Midway veterans remained alive. The last Japanese survivor Petty Officer Kazuo Sakamaki, died in 2019 at age 97. The last American, Seaman First Class Jim Downing, died in 2018 at age 104. With their deaths, the direct human testimony of Midway passed from memory into history. But the ocean remembers. Every year on June 4th, the U.S. Navy conducts memorial services at Midway Atoll, now a wildlife refuge where albatross nest on runways that once launched torpedo bombers. The ceremony is simple: wreath-laying, rifle salutes, the reading of names. 307 Americans, 3,057 Japanese, each name a universe of unfinished futures. What would those men think? Could they see the world their sacrifice purchased? A Pacific dominated by trade rather than war, Japan and America as allies, the atoll itself transformed from fortress to sanctuary? The final mathematics are these: 4 carriers sunk, 3,000 lives lost, and a war's trajectory permanently altered in 6 minutes of bombing. The dead bought time. Time for American industry to gear up, time for new carriers to launch, time for the inexorable arithmetic of production to grind out victory. Midway didn't end the Pacific War. It simply made the ending inevitable. On a June morning in 1942, Japanese carriers steamed toward what they believed was an ambush they would spring. Instead, they sailed into an ambush prepared by cryptanalysts and radar operators and dive bomber pilots who got lucky when chaos aligned with preparation. The ocean accepted what they brought: steel, fire, bodies, pride. The ocean accepted without judgment, without mercy, without memory beyond the artifacts that rest in the deep. But we remember. We must remember. Because the price of forgetting is paid in repetition, and the dead of Midway, American and Japanese alike, deserve better than to have their sacrifice erased by time's indifference. The sea holds them still. History floats above, and we are left to count the cost.